Okay, I've made this little video presentation to focus specifically on Story of an Hour. But what I want you to do is think about the things we talk about, and we'll be applying the same principles we talk about in this video to basically all the stories that we read. So first, there's just kind of an overview here. Kate Chopin was pretty controversial and not published much when she was writing near the end of the 19th century. Most of her work kind of remained on the fringes or margins of the literary world until the 1970s. She was rediscovered and kind of entered the mainstream of literature because of the feminist nature of her writing. For example, a woman's life during her lifetime was far different than a 21st century woman's. Women had far fewer options then than they do now. You might get the feeling this story suggests that marriage, especially for a woman, could be a very oppressive and limiting experience for women. Men really didn't like the idea that maybe a woman might not be so upset when she finds out her husband is dead, because it may be a very liberating thing for the woman. That's one of the reasons why her work was never accepted by the kind of male-dominated power structure at the time. Her work at the time that she was writing was seen as rebellious and kind of on the far end of it, almost sacrilegious. However, feminists and those involved in the women's movement, her work was a critique of the social marginalization of women a society imposes on women. In the most general sense, you could say that Story of an Hour is a marriage story, but if you want to be more specific, you could say it's a story concerning the lack of power and authority women had over their own lives during this era. Now, a couple things. If you like Chopin and would want to read more, I'm going to kind of mention one work, and there's another one here. Another really great short story by Kate Chopin is called Desiree's Baby. I think you'd really enjoy it. And there's a very short novel. This is kind of her big work, The Awakening. You can find this free all over the internet. So if it's something that you're curious about or you would want to read more, those would be two good things to read. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on exploring various excerpts from Story of an Hour. The discussion is going to cover textual evidence, critical reading, and introduction to the elements of fiction. And I really want to focus a lot on looking at the relationship between textual evidence, critical reading, and how these elements of fiction work together. So the first thing we're going to talk about is exposition. So the first sentence of Story of an Hour reads, knowing that Mrs. Millard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So what do we know about her? Well, we already know she has a heart problem, a weak heart, some kind of heart disease. So this is called exposition. So the first part of most short stories, and in this case, the first sentence, provides the reader with information or background that'll contribute to the reader's understanding. It's like, here's what you need to know for the rest of the story to make sense, okay? It's important to know of her health condition, otherwise the ending of the story would not be very believable. So the next story you're going to read is called Rose for Emily. So exposition is very important for that story because the discussion board you have to do deals with why the narrator calls Rosemary, Rose in Rose for Emily, fallen monument, a tradition, a duty, a care, hereditary obligation. So that's kind of what you have to deal with. So think about how that kind of information is in the exposition, and you need to think about, well, why does the narrator steer that way? So when the doctors came, they said she died of heart disease, the joy that kills. So the exposition also lets us understand that there's irony in this story. We know she has a weak heart. Thus, we know that she really wasn't overwhelmed with joy causing her heart to fail. She was overcome with disappointment that her life would go back to the way it was. In short, we know what the doctors don't. And I think that's kind of a good way to think about irony. We know what they don't know, okay? So in this case, we know that she didn't die because she was just so thrilled and overjoyed her poor little heart wouldn't take it. She died mostly because she was disappointed that this new freedom that she had anticipated was snatched away from her. Here's another quick outtake from the story that shows how she perceived her life prior to the news of the death of Brantley. Okay, so this is kind of how she just pictured her whole life. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she'd thought with a shudder that life might be long. So after hearing about Brantley's death, she was looking forward to life because she would be free and be able to do what she wanted to do. Um, because prior to that, her life was pretty limited. So that's kind of, again, I want you to kind of understand about this notion of textual evidence. We can find evidence to kind of support our ideas. Okay, so let's talk about setting, protagonist, antagonist, and conflict. And I think conflict will be on the next screen. So setting, I kind of think we covered the setting in this of this story when we talked about really the overview and the exposition. Okay, so this was set in a time when the roles of women, and in this case, their role within the cultural expectations related to marriage, were quite different than now. So, thus, kind of in general sense, a marriage story. So, when we talk about protagonist, we ask the question, who changes? Well, Mrs. Millard certainly changes when she's pondering how her life would be different, even better, because of the death of her husband. The following quote from the story provides textual evidence for that claim. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. Okay, so she goes through a serious change. Her whole way of viewing her life has been, totally turned around here. So again, it's textual evidence that we really need. We don't have to read between the lines. We don't have to look for hidden meaning. It's all there. Okay, so we're going to talk about antagonist. Antagonist would be characters or forces that influence or cause the protagonist to experience some kind of change. All right. So a lot of people would say that Brantley is the antagonist because his presumed death causes Mrs. Millard to change. However, he really doesn't do anything to her. Maybe the antagonist is related to setting, or the cultural norms related to marriage, or the role of women. This is relevant because we get a good idea of how she feels about marriage from this excerpt. One of the things you will notice, I kind of come at this at different ways. And antagonist is a little more ambiguous. And what I'm looking for from you guys all throughout this semester is not so much that I agree if you identify somebody or something as the antagonist. It's not so much that I'm going to agree with you or that I even need to agree with you. I'm concerned with, do you present good reasons for that claim of who or what the antagonist is? And you should be able to find that in textual evidence. You might be able to find that within some of these other elements of fiction. So just kind of keep that in mind throughout the semester. I'm not really about whether you're right or wrong. I'm really more about how well you support your ideas, okay? And you'll notice here we're kind of looking at textual evidence. And we're also looking at some elements of fiction. So she says this, she says, there'd be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. I got to tell you, this is one of my favorite lines, really, in short fiction, because it has a lot of truth to it. People do feel like they have the right to impose their will on others, but what makes you think you have the right to impose your will on others? We do it all the time. We do it in relationships. I'm sure that some of you had the great idea that you were in a relation with somebody and you'd just be able to change that person. Yeah, well, the question I would ask, well, what right do you have to impose your will on that person? And what makes you think you can change them? And probably the most important part is, the question to ask is, well, how did that work out for you? I haven't seen it work out very often. So this quote right here, I really like this quote. I think it's pretty true. Now, conflict and some central questions. Did she love him? Did he love her? Was he a bad husband? Well, these are all questions people ask about this story all the time. So let's start with conflict. It's really not between Brantley and Louise. It's between Louise's feelings about marriage and the cultural norms of the time regarding a woman's role in marriage. She feels that marriage is oppressive for some women, or at least for herself. There's plenty of textual evidence to support this claim. We've already covered a lot of that textual evidence in the discussion of setting protagonist and antagonist. So in this section, I'm going to post a question and answer it with a specific example from the story, using textual evidence to support ideas. Did she love him? And yet she loved him sometimes. Often she did not. What did it matter? What could love and unsolved mystery count for the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Okay, so she doesn't say she didn't love him. She says she loved him sometimes. Well, you know, if you've been married long enough, you're going to find that some days you love your spouse more than others. And I think that's kind of an honest thing. And that's what she says here. So it wasn't like she hated the guy. Okay, now the other question is, did he love her? Was he a bad husband? We'll just do two questions there. And here's some textual evidence maybe that answers that question. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. So, was Brantley a bad guy? Well, I don't think so. She says she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, and the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. Sounds like Brantley might have been a pretty good guy. So really, Brantley's not the problem here. It seems like marriage is kind of the problem. Point of view. Okay, so, or narration, sometimes we refer to it as point of view. Narration as an element of fiction is sometimes more significant than other times. The most typical, oh man, hang on, I want to go back. Hang on, you guys, let me fix this. Okay, there we go. All right, sorry about that. I'm not a pro at this. So, in Story of an Hour, it's narrated in what's called third person omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing or all-seeing. A lot of people think of the idea of God as omniscient. He knows everything. Santa Claus, you know, he knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. So, omniscient. So this means that we're in Mrs. Millard's head. When we know, that should be we, not when, we know what she's thinking and feeling. This is appropriate for the story because it's all about what she is thinking and what she is feeling in the situation. We can't tell, nobody else can tell us, none of the other people in her house can tell us what she was feeling. It would be weird for her to just be like talking to us, the reader, and tell us what it's feeling. So this works pretty good. Now, when you're going to read Rose for Emily, the next story, that one is actually told in the second person. It's told by one of the people who lives in the town. So second person is basically somebody who's recalling or reporting on events that he or she observed. In this story, people often view the narrator as kind of representative of the whole town, so that's something to think about. And I think it's really important in Rose for Emily that it is second person because it kind of shapes everything. All right, so this is one of the people that lives there and is telling us about all this weird stuff that Emily's done and is up to. Occasionally a narrator is first person. Think of this as the protagonist of the story telling the story about what they experienced. So that would be like me telling you something that happened to me, or you saying, hey, we went to a party the other night and here's all the stuff that happened, or that kind of stuff. And, you know, we're going to read a few stories that are in first person. You don't read a lot of stories in first person because one of the kind of problems with first person, and it's not always a problem, is, you know, ask yourself this: are you the best narrator for your own story? Or are you going to make yourself look better or leave parts out? So it really has to do with how reliable the narrator is. But in the stories we're going to read, it works perfectly. So we'll read this story called Lusus Naturae later on, and that's in first person. And we'll read a couple more. Symbolism. All right, symbolism is basically some idea or imagery that suggests an idea beyond a literal meaning. Typically, symbols in literature are fairly conventional. You don't really have to go looking at them. I think this is kind of why people, when they talk about hidden meaning, they're thinking about symbolism. And most symbols are pretty pretty conventional. For example, we assign meaning to seasons all the time. Spring equals rebirth or renewal. Summer is growth or vitality. Autumn or fall is decline, and winter is death. That's the way we talk about these seasons, and that's kind of what the seasons do. So we also kind of we'll talk about people in terms, oh, they're in the autumn of their life. There's winter in his hair. Somebody who's really gray. Those kind of things. So it's kind of important in this story, and it's important in the scene where she goes up to her room. She's looking out the window, and the outside is this very vivid scene. Okay, she could see in the open square before her house, the tops of the trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves, and the patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. Okay, so she's looking out her window and she's just seeing it. It's almost kind of electric the way that she describes it. It's very alive, and it even says this. I mean, again, textual evidence, you don't have to go look at it. She says, everything was aquiver with new spring life. Well, so spring means renewal, rebirth. So what is happening to her when she's up in this room? She's reconsidering her life. She's seeing the rest of her life in a whole new way, almost kind of a rebirth or renewal. Okay, so she begins her realization of freedom, and it's her rebirth. Two other examples of symbolism. One's a bit of a stretch. I'll talk about those. So Mrs. Millard was afflicted with heart trouble. Okay, we know that from the exposition. We know she literally has a medical heart condition, but we also associate heart with love. That's pretty conventional. I mean, Valentine's Day, right? So is she also having trouble with love? So she has a heart problem in a very physical, literal way, but she also has one in kind of an emotional or psychological kind of way. So this heart kind of, is again pretty conventional, but, using heart for love is also very conventional. So you could argue that she did attain freedom. So this one's the one that's a stretch. Let me back up. So one could argue that she did attain freedom through death. Death equals freedom. One could make a case for that. I don't know. You could probably play it out. Here's one more. And this one, I think, actually, I'm not quite sure where this falls, but I think it's a very interesting thing to note, okay? So at some point, partway through the story, all of a sudden, instead of being referred to as Mrs. Millard, she's referred to as Louise, which is her first name. I do think this is very symbolic of her seeing her identity transform for a person who's basically consumed by another into her own individual person. So she has her husband's last name, and she's just kind of all tied up in that. And when he dies, she begins to see that she's now her own person. So, but when you read the story, if you read it again, you'll notice that this thing happens in the story. She transforms from Mrs. Millard to Louise. Okay. So now here's a little note. When you read Rose for Emily, this has to do with symbolism. Ask yourself, where is the rose? And that's all I'm going to say about that. But think about that while you're reading the story, because titles are kind of important in the story. And Rose for Emily would assume something about a rose. Now, what do we know about a rose in a symbolic nature? Well, we already kind of talked about that. So if you're reading the next story after this one, think about that. Theme. Students often confuse what a story is about with the story's theme. These are two separate things. We don't really need to discuss what a story is about. Usually that's simple. I've read the story, you've read the story, we all kind of have an idea of what it's about. You don't have to retell me the whole story. On the other hand, theme can be a bit more difficult, okay? Not really, but it's a little more touchy. Think of theme as what the story is saying about the topic of the story, okay? So there's something that the story is about, what is it saying about the topic of the story? And I didn't put this in here, but here's kind of the way I think about it is, okay? The story is about something. So Mrs. Millard's story is kind of about marriage at the latter part of the 19th century, and her husband dies and stuff. But the theme is, what kind of truth is the author trying to get to about that situation? And I don't want to say the truth. I'm more comfortable saying a truth. Is a truth about a woman's marriage in that era? Is it a truth that it is probably far more oppressive than a marriage would be now? Would it be true that women didn't really have very many choices? So these are the kind of things to think about when you think about theme. And we can kind of look at these other elements of fiction, and they can kind of lead us to a theme. So you kind of have to play with that. I would say that as we move towards kind of larger writing projects about specific stories, I'm going to give you, your next assignment is actually asking you to kind of do an analysis of a story using elements of fiction. If in English 101, we always talk about writing process, and we talk about brainstorming and, you know, just kind of roughing out ideas and seeing where they lead us. And I think when we're writing about literature, it's also a good thing to maybe just go through. I'm only going to have you guys deal with 9 elements of fiction, so, you know, we're not going to do the whole thing because it'd be too crazy. But what you can do is you can kind of start answering questions about protagonist, antagonist, conflict, and theme and symbolism and those kind of things as you do it, and just kind of rough out your initial ideas. I think what you'll find is it kind of leads you to some pretty clear ideas that you can use to develop and support a piece of writing. Now, another way to think of theme is a way as what the story is saying about the topic. It's like a thesis statement, okay, for an essay. You have the topic of your essay, you have your opinion and your main idea, that equals a thesis statement, okay? So here's an example. Story of an Hour is about a woman's reaction to her husband's topic, death. Is that topic? Yes. But her reaction brings her to the realization of the oppressive nature of marriage. That's the main idea. That's the theme. So the topic is this kind of marriage story. The theme is that during this time in this setting, marriage can be pretty oppressive. We could easily use a variety of elements of fiction combined with textual evidence to support this claim. Often for a literature essay, you can form some idea about the theme and then spend the rest of the paper giving reasons, evidence in the form of elements of fiction and textual evidence to develop and support your ideas. So I want to just kind of set the tone for kind of how we're going to be talking about literature as we go through the course. And I think Story of an Hour is a really good starting place and kind of really a template for everything we're going to do in here. I will post this. So there's also going to be I'll just have the non-video version of this PowerPoint posted. So if you want to just read through it, and we're going to kind of begin to apply these things very, very soon. You'll notice you have an elements of fiction essay coming up. And actually, I've used Story of an Hour as kind of a model for this. So hopefully we'll be ready to do that. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. And I hope you found this video helpful.